Vienna, 1765. Inside the Habsburg Palace, servants move through walls that are thick enough to conceal entire corridors. Behind the ornate stoves that heat the imperial apartments, invisible hands feed wood into fires that keep the Habsburg rulers warm. In the rooms above, Empress Maria Theresa governs an empire so vast that it stretches from Belgium to Transylvania, from the Austrian Netherlands to the borders of the Ottoman Empire. But the true power of the Habsburgs wasn't just in the territories they controlled. It was in the palaces they built, the secrets they kept within those walls, and the image of divine authority they projected through every column, every chandelier, every carefully designed garden path. The story of Habsburg power in the 18th century is inseparable from the story of their palaces. These weren't just homes, they were stages for political theater, fortresses of family secrets, and physical manifestations of a dynasty that believed it had been chosen by God to rule. And at the heart of this architectural empire stood two magnificent structures that would come to define Habsburg grandeur: the Hofburg, their winter fortress in the heart of Vienna, and Schönbrunn, their summer palace that rivaled Versailles itself. But before we can understand these palaces, we need to understand the woman who transformed them into symbols of imperial might. Maria Theresa came to power in 1740 under circumstances that should have destroyed her reign before it even began. She was a woman in a world that didn't believe women could rule. She inherited an empire that was on the verge of collapse, and almost immediately she faced a war that threatened to tear apart everything her ancestors had built. When her father, Emperor Charles VI, died in October 1740, he left behind the Pragmatic Sanction, a document meant to ensure that his daughter could inherit the Habsburg lands. But paper guarantees meant nothing to Prussia's Frederick II. Within months of Charles's death, Frederick invaded Silesia, the wealthy Habsburg province that was one of the jewels of the empire. He calculated that a young woman, barely 23 years old, couldn't possibly defend herself against his armies.
The War of Austrian Succession would last 8 years, from 1740 to 1748. France joined Prussia. Bavaria staked its own claim to Habsburg territories. Saxony mobilized its troops. It seemed like every major power in Europe had decided that the Habsburg Empire was ready to be carved up and distributed like a feast. Maria Theresa stood alone against them all. Well, not entirely alone. She made a dramatic journey to Hungary, appeared before the Hungarian Diet, and made an impassioned plea for their support. The Hungarian nobles, moved by her courage and her vulnerability, pledged their swords to her cause. According to legend, they rose as one and cried out, "Moriamo pro rege nostro," "Let us die for our king." That phrase is significant. They called her their king, not their queen, because in their world, queens were just the wives of rulers. Kings were the rulers themselves, and Maria Theresa, whether they liked it or not, was a ruler. She lost Silesia. Frederick kept his stolen province, but she kept everything else. She kept Austria, she kept Hungary, she kept Bohemia, she kept the vast, sprawling, multilingual empire that her ancestors had spent centuries building. And then she did something that no one expected. She started rebuilding it stronger than it had ever been before. The reforms that Maria Theresa implemented between 1748 and her death in 1780 transformed the Habsburg state. She centralized the administration, stripping power from regional nobles and creating a more efficient bureaucratic structure. She reformed the tax system, establishing a fairer system that increased state revenue. She doubled state income between 1754 and 1764. From 20 million florins to 40 million florins. By 1780, the year of her death, Habsburg revenue had reached 50 million florins. She overhauled the military, establishing a standing army of 110,000 men, 60,000 more than her father had commanded. She introduced compulsory education for all children between the ages of 6 and 12, making the Habsburg lands one of the first states in Europe to mandate universal schooling. But perhaps most importantly for our story, she transformed Schönbrunn Palace into a statement of Habsburg power that would echo through the ages. The site that would become Schönbrunn had been Habsburg property since 1569, when Emperor Maximilian II purchased the floodplain to use as a hunting ground. The name itself comes from Emperor Matthias, who supposedly discovered a beautiful spring there and declared it a schöner Brunnen, a beautiful fountain. But the palace that we know today was born from the vision of Leopold I, who commissioned the Baroque architect Johann Bernhard Fischer von Erlach to design an imperial residence at the end of the 17th century. Fischer von Erlach's original plans were grandiose beyond belief. He envisioned a palace that would sit atop the hill where the Gloriette now stands, a structure so massive and so magnificent that it would dwarf Versailles. But reality, in the form of limited funds and practical constraints, forced more modest ambitions. The palace was built at the foot of the hill instead, and Joseph I would use it primarily as a hunting lodge. It was Maria Theresa who transformed Schönbrunn from a hunting lodge into an imperial showcase. Between 1740 and 1750, she commissioned extensive renovations and expansions. The architect, Nicholas Picassi, was brought in to oversee the transformation. The result was a palace with 1,441 rooms, decorated in the Rococo style that Maria Theresa favored, painted in the distinctive yellow that would come to be known as Maria Theresa yellow or Kaisergelb, Imperial yellow. This color wasn't chosen randomly. Throughout the Habsburg domains, important government buildings were painted this shade. If you were anywhere in the empire and you saw a grand building painted yellow, you knew immediately that it represented Habsburg authority. The interior of Schönbrunn was designed to overwhelm visitors with imperial majesty. The Great Gallery, a ballroom stretching 40 meters long, featured white and gold stucco work, elaborate ceiling frescoes, and massive crystal chandeliers. This was where Maria Theresa held state banquets and diplomatic receptions. This was where the power of the Habsburg Empire was displayed in its most concentrated form. The Hall of Ceremonies served as her audience chamber, where she would sit enthroned beneath a canopy of state to receive ambassadors and supplicants. But Schönbrunn wasn't just about public displays of power. Maria Theresa had 16 children, and the palace needed to accommodate her enormous family. She married those children strategically across Europe, implementing a Habsburg policy that had served the dynasty for centuries. As their motto went, Bella gerant alii, tu felix Austria nube. Let others wage war, you happy Austria, marry. Her daughter Marie Antoinette would marry the French Dauphin, the future Louis XVI. Another daughter, Maria Carolina, would become Queen of Naples. Her sons would secure alliances with other royal houses. Through marriage, Maria Theresa extended Habsburg influence without the cost of war. The gardens at Schönbrunn were as carefully designed as the palace itself. The great parterre stretched between the palace and the Neptune fountain, a formal garden in the French style inspired by Versailles. But Maria Theresa added features that reflected the intellectual currents of her time. In 1752, she established the Tiergarten, the world's first zoo where exotic animals were kept for study and display. An orangery was erected around 1755 to house tropical plants. Later, the Roman ruin would be constructed, a fashionable folly that reflected the Romantic movement's fascination with the grandeur of falling empires. And at the top of the hill, overlooking all of this Baroque splendor, stood the Gloriette. This colonnade structure, built in Maria Theresa's later years, was designed to glorify Habsburg power and the concept of the just war. Ironically, the stones used to build it were recycled from the near demolition of another palace. The Gloriette served as a viewing platform, a place where the imperial family could take their coffee and look down upon Vienna spread out below them. It was a statement of permanence, a declaration that the Habsburgs would endure. But Schönbrunn was the summer residence. For most of the year, the real center of Habsburg power was the Hofburg, in the heart of Vienna itself. The Hofburg was older, more sprawling, and in many ways more mysterious than Schönbrunn. Its origins stretch back to the 13th century, when it was built as a medieval fortress. Over the centuries, it had been expanded by each successive Habsburg ruler, growing organically into a complex that eventually encompassed 18 wings, 19 courtyards, and 2,600 rooms spread across 240,000 square meters. It was, in effect, a city within a city.
The Hofburg was where the serious business of empire took place. This was where Maria Theresa governed. This was where she met with her advisors, including the brilliant Count Wenzel Anton von Kaunitz, who served as her state chancellor and helped orchestrate the famous reversal of alliances that saw Austria abandon Britain and ally with France against Prussia. This was where decisions were made that affected millions of lives across Europe. The architecture of the Hofburg reflected its long history. The Swiss Gate, built in 1552 and designed by Pietro Ferrabosco, was one of the few Renaissance structures in Vienna. It featured Ferdinand I's coat of arms and was flanked by statues of soldiers, a reminder of the turbulent times when Vienna was besieged by Turkish armies. The Augustinian wing housed the court church, where Habsburg weddings took place. Behind the Loreto Chapel lay the Hearts Crypt, where 54 hearts of Habsburg family members were preserved in silver urns. The Habsburgs had a peculiar burial tradition. Their bodies were interred in one place, their hearts in another, and their internal organs in yet a third location. Even in death, they were divided. The 18th century saw major Baroque expansions to the Hofburg. Johann Bernhard Fischer von Erlach, the same architect who had designed the initial plans for Schönbrunn, was commissioned to create magnificent additions. After his death in 1723, his son Joseph Emanuel Fischer von Erlach took over the work. Between 1723 and 1735, the court library was built to house the Habsburg book collection. Today, it's the Austrian National Library, and its Great Hall is considered one of the most beautiful library interiors in the world. The architect Lucas von Hildebrandt, seeing his opportunity after Fischer's death, designed the Imperial Chancellery wing. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the Hofburg wasn't what you could see, it was what was hidden. The walls between rooms in the Hofburg were extraordinarily thick enough to conceal entire corridors where servants could move unseen. This wasn't just about convenience, it was about creating an illusion of effortless grandeur. When you visited the Habsburg court, when you were granted an audience with the Empress or later the Emperor, you weren't supposed to see the machinery that made the imperial household function. You weren't supposed to glimpse the servants who kept everything running. The fires in the ornate stoves that heated the rooms were fed from behind through these hidden passages. Food appeared as if by magic. The Emperor and Empress seemed to exist in a realm apart from ordinary concerns. These hidden passages also served another purpose. They allowed for private conversations and secret meetings away from prying eyes. In a court where every word might be reported, where foreign ambassadors watched for any sign of weakness, where courtiers jockeyed for position and favor, the ability to move unseen was valuable. We can only imagine what conversations took place in those narrow corridors, What plots were hatched? What secrets were shared? The Spanish riding school, also part of the Hofburg complex, housed the famous Lipizzaner stallions. These white horses, trained in the art of classical dressage, performed in the Baroque winter riding school built between 1729 and 1735. The performances were more than just entertainment. They were demonstrations of discipline, of training, of the transformation of wild nature into something refined and controlled. They were, in their way, a metaphor for the Habsburg vision of governance itself. And then there was the treasury, the Schatzkammer, 20 rooms filled with the accumulated wealth and regalia of the Holy Roman Empire and the Austrian Empire. Here you could see the imperial crown of the Holy Roman Empire, octagonal and studded with precious gems, more than 1,000 years old. Here was the crown of Rudolph II, covered in countless stones. Here were robes, scepters, crucifixes, jewels, all the symbols and insignia of power accumulated over centuries. And here, famously, you could see the elaborate table settings used at court, including the mysterious imperial fold per napkins. This napkin fold deserves its own moment of attention. According to legend, the technique for creating this elaborate fold, which held a bread roll in its hollows, was known to only 2 people at any given time, who would pass the secret to a successor before they died. In an age before photography, before YouTube tutorials, such secrets could actually be maintained. The fact that something as seemingly trivial as a napkin fold was treated as a closely guarded secret tells us something important about Habsburg court life. Everything was ritual. Everything had meaning. Everything was designed to reinforce the message that the Habsburgs were different, special, chosen. Maria Theresa lived and ruled in these palaces until her death in 1780. She had transformed a failing empire into a major European power. She had defended her right to rule against those who believed women couldn't govern. She had reformed the military, the economy, education, and administration. And she had created in Schönbrunn and the Hofburg 2 of the most magnificent royal residences in Europe. But her personal life was far from the fairy tale that the Baroque splendor might suggest. She was deeply in love with her husband, Francis Stephen, who died in 1765. His death devastated her. She went into mourning so profound that she even considered giving up her authority to her eldest son, Joseph. She never remarried. She spent the last 15 years of her life ruling alongside Joseph as co-regent, though their relationship was often turbulent. Joseph, influenced by Enlightenment ideas, wanted to push reforms further and faster than her mother was comfortable with. Their correspondence reveals constant tension, with Maria Theresa resisting her son's more radical proposals, while Joseph grew increasingly frustrated with what he saw as her conservatism. When Maria Theresa died on November 29, 1780, she was mourned throughout the empire. Even Frederick the Great, her lifelong rival, the man who had stolen Silesia and forced her to fight for her inheritance, paid tribute to her. He wrote that she had honored her throne and her sex, and that although he had fought 3 wars against her, he had never considered her his enemy. It was perhaps the highest compliment one 18th-century monarch could pay to another. Joseph II, now ruling alone, moved quickly to implement the reforms his mother had resisted. But that's a story for another time. What matters for our story is that the palaces Maria Theresa left behind continued to serve as the center of Habsburg power for more than a century after her death. Franz Joseph, who would become the longest reigning emperor of Austria, was born at Schönbrunn in 1830. He spent much of his life there and died there in 1916 at the age of 86, having ruled for 68 years. His wife, Elizabeth, known as Sissi, would become as famous as Maria Theresa, though for very different reasons. Sissi was extraordinarily beautiful, and she knew it. She spent hours each day on her hair care routine and followed strict diets to keep her tiny waist. She exercised obsessively. She wrote poetry. She traveled constantly, fleeing the suffocating protocols of the Habsburg court whenever she could. She commissioned the Achillean, a palace on the Greek island of Corfu, as her private retreat. Her apartments in both Schönbrunn and the Hofburg were designed to her exacting specifications. In the Hofburg, her bathroom featured the finest copper tub available, resting on Vienna's first linoleum floor, installed in 1880. But Sissi was trapped in a loveless royal marriage, much like Princess Diana would be more than a century later. She struggled with what we would now recognize as mental health issues. She sought escape in travel, in beauty regimens, in anything that might distract her from the prison of her position. And in 1898, she was assassinated by an Italian anarchist in Geneva. She'd been stabbed with a sharpened file, but the wound was so small and her corset was laced so tightly that she didn't immediately realize what had happened. She walked on for a few steps before collapsing. She was 60 years old. The palaces continued. The Habsburg Empire continued. But the world was changing. The long 19th century was coming to an end. The old order of monarchs and empires was about to be swept away by war and revolution. In June 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Habsburg throne, was assassinated in Sarajevo. The event triggered a chain reaction that would lead to World War I. And when that war ended in November 1918, the Habsburg Empire ended with it. Emperor Charles IA, the last Habsburg emperor, was forced to renounce his participation in state affairs, though he refused to formally abdicate. The palace became the property of the newly founded Austrian Republic. Schönbrunn and the Hofburg survived the fall of the dynasty that built them. They survived World War I, and they survived World War II. Today, they're museums, tourist attractions, monuments to a vanished world. The Hofburg serves as the official residence of the President of Austria, but the imperial apartments have been preserved exactly as they were when Franz Joseph and Sissi lived there. You can walk through those rooms today and see the comparative restraint of their private spaces, such a contrast to the exuberant splendor of the state.
The Habsburgs are gone. The empire is gone. But the palaces remain. Yellow paint still bright in the Austrian sun. Gardens still immaculate. Rooms still furnished as they were when emperors walked those halls. They're monuments now, museums, UNESCO World Heritage Sites. But they're also time capsules, preserving a moment when one family believed it could rule half of Europe, when divine right was taken seriously, when the right marriage could be worth more than a dozen military victories. And perhaps most importantly, they remind us that power is always, at least in part, a performance. The elaborate ceremonies, the hidden servants' corridors, the mysterious napkin folds, the Baroque excess of gold leaf and crystal chandeliers, all of it was designed to create an impression, to make the Habsburgs seem more than human, chosen, special, irreplaceable. It worked for a very long time. From the 13th century to 1918, the Habsburgs ruled from these palaces. That's more than 600 years. Most modern nations haven't existed for that long. The United States is younger. Germany, as a unified nation, is younger. The Habsburg Empire outlasted the Roman Empire in the West. It survived the Black Death, the Reformation, the 30 Years' War, the Turkish sieges, the Napoleonic Wars, and countless other crises. But it couldn't survive the modern age. The world wars and nationalism and democracy were forces that even the most magnificent palaces couldn't withstand. The last emperor left. The servants were dismissed. The hidden corridors fell silent. The treasury was catalogued and turned into a museum. The Lipizzanner stallions kept dancing, but now they performed for tourists rather than emperors. When you visit Schönbrunn or the Hofburg today, you're visiting a tomb of sorts. Not the tomb where Habsburg bodies were buried, that's in the Capuchin crypt, but a tomb for a way of life, for an entire political system, for the idea that some people were born to rule and others were born to obey. These palaces were built to last forever, and in a sense, they have. But the world they were built for is gone, preserved now only in museums and history books and the stories we tell about power and glory and inevitable decline. Maria Theresa understood this better than most. She knew that power was fragile, that it had to be fought for and maintained through constant vigilance and reform. She knew that the magnificent palaces were tools, that they served a purpose beyond just providing luxury for the royal family. They were statements, they were arguments, they were proof that the Habsburgs deserved to rule. Whether that proof was convincing depends on your perspective. But standing in the great gallery at Schönbrunn, beneath those crystal chandeliers, surrounded by gold and marble and the accumulated artistic achievement of an empire, it's hard not to be impressed. It's hard not to understand why people believed. It's hard not to feel, just for a moment, the weight of Habsburg power. And that's why these palaces matter. Not because they're beautiful, though they are. Not because they're historically significant, though they certainly are. But because they show us how power worked in a very different world. A world where a single family could rule millions of people across thousands of miles for hundreds of years. They show us the machinery of monarchy, the secrets and the splendor, the hidden servants' corridors and the public display of wealth and authority. The Habsburgs built their power in these grand 18th-century palaces, and in the end, those palaces outlasted them. They're all that remains of an empire that once stretched across Europe. They're monuments to ambition and achievement, and ultimately to the inevitable passing of all human power. Visit them if you can. Walk through those halls, climb to the gloriette, stand in the treasury and look at those 1,000-year-old crowns. And remember that this was once the center of the world, the beating heart of one of history's greatest empires. Remember that Maria Theresa governed from these rooms. Remember that Sisi fled from them. Remember that Franz Joseph died in them. Remember that the